love about NAMAC and this meeting is it's time to also talk about process, what sometimes doesn't work, so that we can begin to build on each other's knowledge and wisdom. And that's what we want to do today. So I'm Schneider. I'm director and founder of Active Voice Lab. And I just want to why don't we just quickly introduce ourselves, because we promise it will not be boring.
I'm Pamela Yates, the creative director at Skylight.
And I'm Paco de Onis, executive director at Skylight.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, cool. I'm Mark Strandquist, creative director of the Performing Statistics Project.
I'm Eaton. I'm a filmmaker, but I also work at ITVS as a content development initiative manager.
Awesome. So how many of you are working in some way with policy? Can you raise your hands really, because it's kind of dark in here? Policy. Okay, so not everybody, but let me just say this. When we were talking this morning, we decided to look up what policy actually means. And it turns out that the words that come up over and over again are things like a plan for action, wisdom. So if you are linking your creative work to some kind of plan for change, you're part of a policy realm. And I think that's a really exciting thing to think about. So we're going to hear today about several different models of that. But I wanted to, first of all, give you a little context for me. Active Voice Lab is not an artist-centered organization. It's an ecosystem-centered organization. So we spend as much time talking about these issues with media makers as we do with funders and advocates and policymakers, helping things go better and helping everybody bring what they do really well to the table. And one of the things that we started thinking about as we were encouraging conversation among and between these various allies is that we needed some kind of common language because there's so much content out there. And it's no longer sufficient to talk about it's short or it's long or it's inspiring or it's feature length. We need to talk about what your work can do, how it contributes to change. And if you can move to the next slide. Oh, I can move to the next slide. What am I saying? This is a metaphor. This is at a place called howdoweknow.net. You can find it on your own. But one of the things that we like to do is think about, again, the strength of different kinds of stories. So we think of some stories as being rakes because they can bring people together. They don't demonize characters. They really deal with people's values. And that might be, someone mentioned Landfill Harmonic, when different people are invited to talk about their own perspectives so that audiences and others can come to the table knowing that they are welcome and that these things can be hashed out. Or trowels. These are also called advocacy films. A trowel, that little sharp shovel, knows where the problem is and directly where to go. And some stories are like that. And many of you may have stories that are trowels, where you really want to move people from a problem to a solution. You don't need to have everybody's attention, everybody's perspective. Trowels are very good for very direct policy, right? Protest, legislation. Some stories are like wheelbarrows. They transport you. And when I think of wheelbarrows, I think of Fruitvale Station, for example. American Promise, character-driven. And they are amazing for broader audiences, not hitting people over the head with the issue, but the issue is kind of subtly laced throughout a journey. So trellises, actually, we're going to hear about a trellis granito. Trellises are stories that lift movements up for light, right? So the amazing Black Panther film that's out from Firelight, it lifted up a movement. Amazing for bringing more people in, even raising money or building coalitions. And Shovels, investigative. It was so great to hear from Joaquin this morning about digging for the truth. Those of you who will not rest, will not stop until you get to the corruption or the injustice. And if we can go to the next slide. And one of the things by working with many of you, oh gosh, what's the matter with me? So lazy. No, it's okay. I'm so lazy. In working with many media makers, we started paying attention to what was missing from our metaphor. And of course, sprinklers. Sandy's storyline, participatory filmmaking. Group storytelling, no single author, but planting the seed and carving the ground for more voices, more justice, more flexibility, nuance, and maybe democracy. So that's kind of how we think about it, but you're going to hear today from a lot of different tools. And one of the things that I think is really important is I'm going to ask everybody presenting today to talk about a big question that guided your strategizing, how your creative process included something that you really felt was important to keep in mind as you were moving forward. Then I'm going to ask you if your question had to shift along the way. As you were taking your creative work into the world, did new elements or new circumstances require you to pivot in some way? And how could those efforts be resonant to everybody here? And then following that, importantly, what question do you wish you'd asked? What was something that you wish had occurred to you in the moment that in retrospect you realized that was absolutely essential? That's what we need to share. We need to talk about the things that we realized over time that we can begin to impart and develop and evolve with each other. So I just really want to thank you all for being here. I'm going to shut up for a while and ask you guys to take it away.
Thank you.
I was in the highlands of Guatemala, and I met a young resistance fighter, a Mayan resistance fighter. And I asked her, why do you do this? How can you withstand the elements? How can you be in the mountains for all these years? And she told me, quiero poner mi granito de arena. I just want to add my tiny grain of sand to liberate my country from a military dictatorship. And it was a lesson that I carried with me throughout my filmmaking career, that each of us have a granito, a tiny grain of sand, to contribute to positive social change. It takes a lifetime. It takes a lifetime commitment to make social change. As a filmmaker, as an activist, as an artist. And I believe the other really important thing is it's important to stay connected to people and places where we've made films. Not necessarily to go back and make films there, but to stay informed, to stay in touch with the people we made the films with, to collaborate on a deeper and deeper level as the years go by. You know, we talk about extractive industries. We talk about academic extractivism. Well, filmmaking can also be extractive. It can be extractive storytelling. So let's create a community, let's create a world where documentary, nonfiction filmmaking is collaborative with the subjects and stay connected to them. And in that vein, I want to talk about one thread of our work at Skylight, which is the work that we've done in Guatemala since 1982. Really, it started with When the Mountains Tremble, which I made with a young Mayan woman. She was 22 years old, living in exile, and her name was Rigoberta Menchú. When the Mountains Tremble was the story of the struggle for democracy in Guatemala against a legacy of brutal military dictatorships. It was during the time of the Soul genocide in the Americas, in Guatemala. At that time that we released the film with Rigoberta Menchú, we worked very closely with the Central American solidarity movements in the United States, in Western Europe, in Latin America, around the world. And the idea for the film was that we wanted to stop U.S. military intervention in Central America because there have been decades of military and economic imposition on the part of the United States. And we traveled around to show the film. And the film was very successful, but we really did not stop military intervention, and we really did not stop the slaughter. And this thing weighed on me because the question was, had we done enough? Had we really gone out with the film? Had we really told the story in the right way? Had we been strategic? Because it didn't really do what we set out for it to do. But we did travel around the world with Rigoberta Menchú. Over the next 10 years, she crisscrossed the world living out of a suitcase. And 10 years after we made the film, she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. She was the first indigenous person and the youngest person at that time to receive the award. And that led to a series of other things.
So Rigoberta had looked for justice in Guatemala for many, many years, and was always denied justice there, access to justice. So she took her case to the Spanish National Court, and there they heard her case. And we decided to make a film about that process too, because they were actually using material that we had filmed in 1982 as evidence in this new case. And so that process, the filming of that process became the film Granito, How to Nail a Dictator. And when in the making of Granito, we worked very closely with the Guatemalan movements for justice, especially the Mayan movement. And before going any further, I was just going to show you a quick trailer of Granito. Could I have the lights down, please? Okay. Went to Guatemala, and the Guatemalan judiciary actually got emboldened at a certain point, and the case, we suddenly heard on very short notice that the case was actually going to begin in Guatemala, a genocide case. The first time in the history of the Americas that the genocide of indigenous people was being put on trial. And so we raced down there, and we decided we have to film this. We don't know what's going to happen, how long the trial would last, if it would even go more than a day, which was usually the case. Impunity really reigns in Guatemala. But we went, the trial happened, we filmed it gavel to gavel for the whole 2 months that it lasted, and which resulted in a guilty conviction for the general. And anyway, so Pamela, you want to take over?
And it was very important for us to put together a Guatemalan crew to film the genocide trial, because we realized that the Guatemalans would continue, the business and political elite would continue to deny that a genocide had happened. So we were in a position of not only the films that we had made, but the covering of the trial and the putting of the highlights of the trial every few days up online to throw the doors of the courtroom to the entire world where people had access to broadband would be critical. It would be critical because there were dueling narratives about what had happened in Guatemala. And we were telling and helping to tell the Mayan perspective, as were the survivors who were testifying in court. To be part of that dueling narrative, we also gave our master of our films to the biggest bootlegger in Guatemala called El Buki. Because you want a human rights film to be bootlegged, right? And he was able to distribute it to all of the marketplaces, and they also sold the bootleg copies right outside the courtroom where the trial was taking place. It was an amazing trial. It was an incredibly dramatic trial, and at the end of the trial, as you may know, Rios Montt was convicted of genocide and crimes against humanity and sentenced to 80 years in prison. But the verdict was overturned after 10 years. The business and political elite pressured the Constitutional Court to overturn the verdict. But all of the forces that were unleashed during the trial, we knew were going to make a huge difference in how Guatemala conducted itself politically over the next period of time. And we decided to make a third film in the Guatemalan trilogy. Remember I talked about how important to stay connected to people and places? This was not really something we planned. This was something that unfolded. This was something that we saw as an opportunity where we could contribute our granito de arena, our tiny grain of sand. The work continues. The Mayan quest for justice has expanded to include political inclusion and the right to defend their lands and resources. And as you'll see, the forces that the trial unleashed has created a movement where the Mayans and the non-Mayans are now coming together. And that's the basis of our next film, 500 Years. We're just going to show you a 2-minute trailer of that.
These are so gorgeous, and it just occurs to me how cinematic your work is. I mean, it's not just about influencing a movement, it's part of a movement, it drives a movement. But I want to ask you, is there something along the way that you wished you'd thought about? You've made a lifetime commitment to this. Are there ideas that would resonate with others here that they might think about as they're moving through a journey like this?
Yes, there's going to be many times when you feel impotent because the forces working against human rights defenders and artists and storytellers are so huge that sometimes we don't feel like we're making a difference. And I would say during the times when you feel impotent to act, it's still really important to document. It's still really important to gather the stories of people. It's still really important to analyze what's going on, because there will be a time. Do you think we ever thought when we were in Guatemala in 1982 that Rios Montt would be put on trial for genocide? Jamás. Never.
Film would be part of the evidence.
And that our film would be part of the key evidence in convicting him. So, you have to be at your station, you have to stay at your station, and then really keep a lookout for what are going to be the strategic opportunities, both politically and artistically.
That is such a great segue because, Nigeria, you actually have multiple stations. You have a station as a filmmaker, a creative person, and a station at ITVS.
Yeah.
So you're not in a position to maybe dig in as deeply and to stay with it. Talk a little bit about this project and how you navigate given all the things that are on your plate right now.
Yeah, there's a lot of things on my plate. Also, thanks so much for letting me follow Pam and Paco, which is like the incredible
Good luck with that.
career. So thank you.
Don't be boring.
It's been amazing. It's really hard, and that's why I have such tremendous respect and admiration for what Pam and Paco have been able to do, because I think more often than not, a lot of filmmakers make the film, feel really passionate about it, can't wait to get it out there, are happy to have it out there, and then there's this feeling of like, well, I have to do the next thing, and it's really hard to sustain telling that community story, because you want to do that as a filmmaker, as someone who gets to know these people and care about the issue and care about the community, and also the community wants it. Like, we're still fighting our fight here, and it would be great to have the continued visibility. And so I think that's a struggle that a lot of filmmakers have, and I have the additional struggle of having a full-time job that's actually really demanding and also really limiting of what I can do. So that's definitely a struggle I kind of play out every single day. It's like a struggle I'm living today in this conference. So yeah, that's very real to me.
So tell us a little bit about Perry County and what drove you. What was the big question you were asking when you got involved with this?
Yeah, so Perry County is a film that really takes a look at what happens when environmental racism and the civil rights movement kind of collide, to take a word from Joaquin this morning, kind of collide in this small county in Alabama. It's one of the top 50 poorest counties in the country. And so, I always start off with these like kind of really simplistic questions, which is what happens in this county is that not only are the residents forced to have a landfill open up across the street from their homes, literally across the street from their homes, then that landfill starts taking in toxic coal ash waste. And so the question I started off with was, why is it allowed? How was it that toxic coal ash waste is forced upon a poor black county? Which, of course, like the answer to that is in the question. And so the kind of digging deep into how is that able to happen? So that's kind of where I started.
Can I ask you something?
Yeah.
Did you work with allies along the way, or did you kind of go on your own as an artist, as a filmmaker, and hope and assume that it would connect eventually?
Yeah, I did not. I mean, a lot of characters who are in the film are people who have their own, who are activists in their communities, and were kind of stumbled into becoming activists. And we met allies along the way, but we really wanted to focus mostly on the citizens who are living the day-to-day of it. And we actually, at first, had a hard time finding allies, and some of the larger environmental groups, actually, this was not on their radar. And it wasn't until after the film was finished that we had an ally like Earth Justice come on and be a partner with the film. And that work started happening like about 4 months after we were there, because for some reason that wasn't rising to the top.
Can we take a look at what Earth Justice saw in this?
Yeah, great. So this is just a bit of the trailer.
Thank you. What were your dreams for this? What did you hope would happen as a result of the hard work you put into this?
Yeah, so one of the things that's actually really important to me with this film, and a lot of the work I do, so if you were at last night's event, you saw a bit of my film First Friday, and with that film and this film, these are both communities I'm part of. So I never officially lived in Alabama, but my entire family is from Selma, Alabama, generations from Selma, Alabama. I spent every summer in Alabama. So it's a community that's really important to me, and as someone who went to journalism school and has worked at organizations or companies like Time, seeing the coverage of the South is insane. It's the most underreported region in the country, one of the most underreported regions in the country. And when people did talk about the South, it was such a disrespectful and total disregard of the people there. And so for me, I really just wanted to give voices to people who look like me and look like people in my family and people who I interact with on a regular basis, in a way that was really nuanced. And after spending time with the people there, they just felt completely disenfranchised. And I want them to know that what they're doing was important, even if they are at this moment are feeling a bit defeated, and that there are other people who are recognizing what they're going through.
So the film is being used and recognized?
Yeah, so after we finished the film, we had screenings all across the country, and we had several screens, 5 screens all throughout Alabama, and these are counties that don't have a movie theater, so really, bringing a projector and a screen and a PA system everywhere we went. We're having them in spaces, which these are incredibly still segregated places. We have a screening in Hill County where literally on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. they still close down the main street because that's when the slave auctions would be. So these are kind of the situations that we were having screenings in. We were able to bring it to really to integrated audiences, and with the screening, with the film, people felt reinvigorated. They had to stop feeling like they lost, and they created a new organization to fight against the landfill called the Black Belt Citizens for Health and Justice. And they've been fighting against the landfill since then. And actually, unfortunately, this was in news last week. The new owners of the landfill are suing for the members for defamation and libel for $30 million. This is a place where the average income is $8,000 a year. And so the fight definitely continues. And so now I'm in talks with the ACLU, who's representing them, to see if there's a new way we can keep.
It's an amazing resource.
Yeah.
As this struggle continues.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you would have done differently, a question you would have liked to have asked along the way that might have paved the way as you went on?
Yeah, well, a question we did ask, but I wish we could go down further. And this question was really uncomfortable for me to even kind of talk about, really in depth in the film. Part of that was like, what is the legacy of civil rights if the people in color, people in power change, but disenfranchisement remains the same? And so, that's a hard question to ask, especially from, again, someone from Alabama, someone I'm trying to, and this is particular to this area, and not say all areas across the South and Black Belt, but there's a reason why the environmental justice movement happens in the exact same areas where the civil rights movement really began. And so that's a question that we started talking about in the film, but it's a question I wish I think it was an issue I wish I knew about earlier on, because I think that's a question that's rife for
totally
further
right.
exploration.
Totally right. It also makes me think, just before we go from a trowel to a sprinkler, this is what you all do as storytellers. You go to the places and you build the trust and you stay connected and you find those deeper truths. And that's why every movement needs you. I can't think of a movement today that doesn't need story. And that's why these relationships are absolutely essential. This is the future. This is how we get information. This is how we build empathy and thereby change policy. So I just wanted for all of you to really, just express my admiration for the fact that being there, witnessing, and telling those stories. So let's hear about new forms of storytelling and where you've been, what you've observed, and how you've brought that to different audiences.
Thank you. First off, it's just getting asked to be up here was both immediately oh my God, this is such an incredible honor, and then horrifying, because you all are doing such amazing work. So, and I didn't know about the sprinkler. I had seen that sort of the icons before, and I was trying to imagine what kind of sprinkler I would be, and I think I like that one, not the.
I wonder if you could be the slip and
Ooh, that would be cool. I like the idea of sort of combining a lot of those. I think with the work, we want to be sprinklers. We want to be sort of not giving voice. It's very important that that's not what this project is about. It's about acknowledging where policies are created, whether they're codes of conduct, memorandums of understanding with police departments, legislative decisions, whose voice is being strategically and systematically silenced or excluded from that conversation, and how can we then use art to amplify or to bring those voices, in this case, incarcerated youth in Virginia. so it's both like Sprinkler, creating that sort of space where participatory storytelling can happen, but also creating tools for advocates, which I guess is more of the trowel model. So, but this project really, just some tiny context. There's over 10,000 8 to 17-year-olds that are locked up in Virginia every year. So the fact that an 8-year-old can be locked up, actually 40% of youth locked up in Virginia are between 8 and 15. I know when I was 8, let alone yesterday, I was making some real bad, dumb decisions, and the idea that you could be, the re-traumatizing impacts of incarceration, especially on younger folks, is just disgusting. But in Virginia, you can also be an officer, a police officer in a school, carry a gun or a taser, and never have any formal training, know nothing about youth development or let alone trauma-informed care. And so to us, when we were beginning this project, it was all about reframing whose policy expertise is valued, whose life is valued, and how, and to us, incarcerated youth in Richmond, Virginia were the voices that experts should be most listening to as they're going forward and trying to transform the juvenile justice system in Virginia. So in a nutshell, we began with the question, how would policy, I'm gonna have to go back and start with the, oh no, it doesn't matter.
Non-linear.
Yeah, exactly, sprinklers. But so the workshops basically took a year and a half of organizing to even begin. Emma from Magnum Foundation, who has been superhero, helped really the first year and a half of organizing the project, where we don't go into a community to do art to them. We come in usually with questions. Those questions were, what would policy reform look like if it was led by incarcerated youth? And how could a multitude of different experts, Virginia's leading policy advocates from Legal Aid Justice Center, artists, radio DJs, teachers, police departments, looking to a multitude of people as part of the solution, not just sort of confronting them as part of the problem. Over a year and a half, we developed a course set of partners and started doing workshops where we were able to get a group of 14 to 17-year-olds out of prison, where they were able to wear their own clothes, come to a space where there were no guards, full of windows, and every week they were working with amazing lawyers to learn about the legal side of things, and then artists to transform that legal knowledge and their personal experience into a multitude of media campaigns. And these range from police training manuals and exhibits that we're using to train every active duty officer in Richmond Police Department, which is 700 officers. The breakout session earlier, one of the questions I wanted to ask was, how do you reach those audiences that are not self-selecting to see your film? How do you reach the idea of bringing them to these supercharged spaces where confluence of people are gathering, as opposed to the community theater where the same 200 people go. And those theaters are amazingly important. I'm just saying it's important, if we're doing this work and we have the honor to hear these stories and help produce them, that we also have that burden of responsibility to get them to the people that most need to hear them. And in Virginia, police departments, legislators who say things like, well, not every teen deserves an education, right? Not every teen deserves a future.
Someone really say that?
Yeah, that was from a education board. So the teens made everything from their own radio PSAs, where we went to a radio station and recorded these pieces about what they wanted people to know about their lives, to photo projects and publications, and a lot of them are on display over there. This is such a nice thing, so I can just be like, go over there.
Not now.
There's a taped off portion right in front of the exhibit. Yep, don't do it now. That's the size of the teens' jail cell. So the newspaper, if you want one, and I please get one, you have to step inside their 6 by 9 foot home that they have to strip down to nothing but their underwear every day, and hear trains and everything right next to them. It's a horribly toxic environment too in many ways. So, but I think what this project maybe has to offer a larger audience is sort of the process. And I view my work in concentric circles. So that first circle is the youth. How do we connect them with not only an abundance of support and amazing sort of overexcited, goofy people that wear short shorts everywhere, but also like amazing mentors, formerly incarcerated adults who were in foster care, in the system, and providing paid, equitably paid, opportunities where they are providing living blueprints for the teens we're working with. So how does that inner circle really create like an incredible environment, learning and building an emotionally supportive environment for the youth? And I think if that circle is there, if you're not treating the people you're working with as unfortunates, if you're treating them as leaders and as experts, and you're supporting them through a multitude of ways, then I think the work that they'll create will just be infinitely more interesting and powerful. So if that first stage is the participants, that second stage is sort of exhibition, and it's really important that we go to non-traditional art spaces. So in this slide, you can see us playing audio on the left side, audio recordings that the teens made directly to the legislators over the microphone. It's as important to bring them to political spaces of power that silence their voices as it is to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in the top right, where 20,000 people saw the teens' work in 2 days, as it is to create publications like the newspaper that's traveling into schools with free curriculum for teachers to bring these conversations into their classrooms, as it is to have parades, because it's important to celebrate these voices, and it's amazing what you can get away with when you don't call it a protest, but a parade. You can have hundreds of people blocking the main street in Richmond. The teens wrote their own protest chants, and we had a marching band and a whole drum corps perform their protest chants at the General Assembly and all the way down Richmond's main street, turning the photos that were in an exhibit context and a gallery and museums into these parade banners. So transforming how a photo can be used and how they can be sort of this vessel to amplify and be a megaphone for these voices.
Did you have policy targets as you were moving forward, or were you just thinking the very expression of an awareness of the situation would be sufficient?
So we work with the teens to sort of identify specific audience targets. So the police training manuals, shifting that institution, shifting the way police are trained, shifting perceptions, shifting their understanding of what it means to make the decision to arrest a youth, was a specific audience. And we talk about how language and aesthetics, it's really media literacy. What project can we create that's gonna like really be a very powerful thing for the police officers to go through, and the same way that we create tools for other youth, tools for teachers to use, the same way that we wrote letters and media projects directed at legislators. So I would be really excited to hear about language and aesthetics, because in Virginia we can't use words like abolition because it's a non-starter with our politicians. I mean, it's the capital of the Confederacy. Our hashtag is prisons don't work, and we're advocating to close 2 youth prisons, one of which, thanks to ourselves and millions of others, we were able to close 1 youth prison in Virginia. But then the governor's, no, because the governor's trying to drop $40 million on a new one, and we're like, so yeah, we have very specific policy goals and audiences, and at the same time, some of this work is unfortunately, in a very tragic way, timeless. In that, and I'm sure that materials you all like, it's still being used. I guess my main thing is like, if you're very intentional about your process as well as your exhibit, and how that exhibit can be sort of not an end point to pat ourselves on the back, but a starting point to organize and activate and disseminate the work in a multitude of ways, I think you can really, the youth you're working with, I think, will not only get, or your participants, will not only get way more out of it, but the materials that you create will have a much bigger impact.
So it's really opportunistic as well.
Yeah.
Was there anything that you wish you'd asked or along the way that you think might have been useful to?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so when we were starting the project, we thought that the hardest thing to do was going to be to get a police department in one of the most conservative states in the country to agree to allow incarcerated youth to train their entire police force. We thought that was going to be the toughest thing. But really the most tragic question, or reality, and the question that I wish I had asked was, how do you make youth caught up in the system believe that their voice can have any impact. I mean, we spent, so much time and energy trying to there's been so many times where I've been working with kids inside where they've said things like, if you thought you're going to be dead or incarcerated by 21, why would you care about school? Why would you care about politics or democracy or your goddamn art project? I think that thinking of the future is a privilege. Being able to imagine yourself in the future is a privilege. And for so many people, unfortunately, they're confined to a reality even long before they end up in the system. And so that's a question we're asking now, is not only how do we, we're about to start another workshop. We got a $500,000 grant because of this first year pilot, and because of that we're able to hire full-time a bunch of 3 formerly incarcerated amazing human beings who are now our lead organizers on the project, because I think for a lot of this work it's important to work yourself out of a job and become obsolete and make room for people who should be leading the way. But these questions are the questions we're asking as we're about to start in 2 weeks, actually a virtual reality project with a new group of teens. So.
That is just fantastic. Congratulations on all of these. I mean, one of the ideas that kind of come together through these stories is that obviously films aren't going to do everything, right? They're not going to solve any one thing at any particular time. They are indeed part of a bigger network, but there are things that stories do uniquely that they bring to that ecosystem. So I thought we'd open it up a little bit and maybe get some suggestions from you about, or questions of these experts. When you're thinking about strategy, when you're thinking about the intersection of the creative process and purpose, what are some of the questions that you're dealing with that you think would be resonant, or lessons that you've learned in the course of your work that we can continue to build on this practice? And I think we have someone with a mic. Is Tricia around? Hi, Tricia.
I'll sprinkle it to you.
Yeah, there's more.
We got more.
Questions?
Questions?
Folks, come on, you have questions. Yes, look, a question.
Surprisingly, it's Kate.
Always full of questions. Actually, I have more of a statement, which I guess can kind of lead into a question. I've been hearing you talk, Mark, for, 200 years now in classrooms and outside of them. But I was just really blown away as somebody who's working in a place where we deal with coal industries and big money and leaders, where so much of the time we're demonizing the people that we're making these projects about, or the impacts that they've had. And I was really impressed when you said about the training manuals for the police officers, that you wanted them to be impacting. And it just really inspired me with the work that we're doing to start thinking about how we can be in dialogue with the people who may not be intentionally bringing harm to their communities, but who are trying to feed their families. So that was really powerful, and I guess I want to know how you arrived at that decision, what the path was like to collaborate with police officers, and what it's like for the youth to train them.
Has it been 200 years?
Almost.
It feels like it. No, in the best of ways. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that 10 years ago, I think I would have screamed at my future self if I had known that I was going to partner with the police department and have coffee with the police chief. But he's part of this. I also should say is could this have happened 2 years ago? I don't think it would have. Without Black Lives Matter, would this have happened? Without decades of activism, with this, there's a national moment that I think is so crucial for us all to be pushing and many others to be pushing. So I want to acknowledge that, but also it was also very strategic. Part of that first year that Emma and others helped sort of us organize was, first year and a half, we did a lot of sort of community forums, and at one of them, so Virginia sends more youth to law enforcement than any state in the country. So they're not trained to deal with youth, to work with youth. Deal is a horrible word to use. And more kids are getting sent to them. And so we held this forum to kind of highlight that. And it was all youth-oriented. They came up with all the questions, the teams we were working with, and they led the dialogue, and it was amazing conversation and super vital. And strategically, at one moment, I posed a question about training and the police chief was like, well, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, well, we're working with incarcerated teens to do this training project. And he said he would love to be involved, and NPR happened to be there and recorded that, and so which is just to say that use those town hall dialogues to really, and obviously with more contentious, non-traditional allies that might not be possible, but it seems like you're using these public moments to really call people on their commitments. But I do think it's really important that police are going to be a part of, I think, the reality of this country for better or worse, the foreseeable future. And I think that it's important to see them as part of the solution. And I think when you do that, and I think that art does that in a unique way, where it can create this incredible humanistic entry point into what are hyper-divisive, traumatic, incredibly charged spaces or conversations, that people I think are more willing and open, and it's not the end point. This is a starting point to kind of push the police department further.
Did you want to take a break?
No, I was just going to say, I think it's so important what you're doing because, we work in many polarized situations like Guatemala or in Colombia, here, and this idea of reaching out to the unusual ally or unexpected possible ally is really key to reconciliation. And without it, you're never really going to get there.
Yeah, it depends on what you're trying to do. I mean, you were not in the position to do that because you were still working in a very antagonistic situation where you were building a base and supporting.
Right. Yeah, but I think now that one of the extraordinary things that happened in Guatemala last year was that the indigenous movement, which just sort of burst out much stronger after the genocide trial. And 2 years after the trial, they ended up toppling the sitting president of Guatemala, who was also an ex-military person from that era. But it wouldn't have happened without all the urban youth that had never really thought about this or been in a protest, because protests were so squashed in Guatemala and so repressed for so long. That unity of the urban middle class and with the Mayan indigenous movement was key to the change. It really was. It couldn't happen if they hadn't gotten together.
I just want to say, kind of speak back to, I can't believe I'm quoting Joaquin again, but his speech this morning about, don't tell him I'm doing this so much, about collision, right? And you're right, I think the thing is this, what an amazing outcome of what your group is doing, and, to reach across whatever aisle that is and talk to each other. And because I think sometimes we think people don't have the same goals in mind. And we do more often than not. And with my new film, not this film, but First Friday, it's a film that really takes a look at Oakland at this big moment of change and shift. But we consciously tried not to and thankfully our characters didn't talk about this, didn't say this word that much. We didn't want to use the G word. We didn't want to use gentrification, right? Because that word is so loaded. And if you live in the Bay Area or you live in New York or you live in so many cities that are going through this change as well, how many conversations have you had with your friends about that, right? And it's always within the same kind of group, and that conversation never moved forward. So we had this intention of wanting to create a film that people from whatever your perspective is on it can come to that film and not feel judged, and then have a conversation around it.
Well, not to get too focused on the metaphor, but that's a rake, right? So a rake brings people from different places together. Doesn't have to go deep. I always gesture widely when I do this. It's a little weird, but rakes take the surface on the surface and actually bring people of different shapes and places and orientations and perspectives into something that shares some common value. And for some issues, you have to start there. Because if you go to the polarized place to begin with, you go to the trowel, and you say, this is the problem, this is what to do about it, they're out of there. Did you have more?
Hey, we had a question here.
I think it's so important for us to think about. First of all, I think it's really important to collaborate with the protagonists in our film at every step of the process, and when you finish the film, don't go away forever. But the other thing is that people have to be really willing, and many people would actually like their lives and the crimes committed to be acknowledged. And they want, it's very powerful for them to acknowledge that. I've worked on films where people that I filmed have said at a certain point, you know, I don't want to be in your film anymore because I don't want to be thought of my entire life as a child soldier from the DRC. And if I'm in your film, that's how I'm going to be codified. And you know what? It's their life. No matter if they've signed a release, I don't really care. It's really going to be up to them. There have been people in our films, we really try to show the films to the protagonists before the films go out into the world. And some people would say that's not having artistic independence, but actually I think it really makes the films better. It makes them more nuanced. They see things I don't see. And I just think if you have this feeling of mutual respect, you can talk through all those problems. I think also just one other thing, which is that sometimes having a really high profile protects you instead of exposes you.
So Wendy is literally breathing down our necks. So do we have time for everybody to answer this quickly, or should we? Okay, good. No, we're going to quickly, yes, our time is up, but we want to hear from everybody, because I think this question is absolutely essential, and the ethics would require a whole day, I think, of us to really get into. But why don't we each have a quick response?
Well, just to follow up on what Pam said, I think that in our work, so many victims actually want to get out of being victimhood. Some don't want to be known that way, but others become empowered. Actually, we've seen so many that have become human rights defenders and have become prominent in the movement for justice, which came from that. So it really depends on how that person feels about what their role is going to be.
Yeah, that's a really important question. And I feel like before you even can really answer that in the course of making your film, you really have to fully understand the community and be down there and really understand what these people are facing. And I think sometimes when you kind of do this parachuting in and out, you don't understand. Maybe that bite from that person actually endangers their job or their livelihood. Like in Perry County, there's basically only 2 employers or 3 employers, and one's a jail, and one's a landfill, and one's they own a thing where you sell a lot livestock auction, yeah. And then there's years of race and racism in there. So what I really just think about is, what is the truth of the film, and if there's something that is actually necessary to tell that story, but it's hurtful for the character. Just weighing out each scenario. Will my film suffer if I leave that out? Will truth suffer if I leave it out? And if it doesn't, then I don't want to do anything to endanger them, because I'm not living in Perry County every day, and they are, and our realities are very different. So I keep that in mind with all the films I make.
Thank you. Mark, you're going to get the last sprinkle. So.
Okay, last sprinkle. So in Richmond with the youth, we actually have to legally not reveal identities. But I think, so I'm trying to think of this question slightly differently, is what's our responsibility after the 8-week workshop? And thanks to this grant, we're mostly thinking about what does reentry look like for these youth, and how can this project create sort of a platform that they're actually able to identify needs, and that we can then sort of try to, needs and assets. So I need safe housing, and I love making film. Okay, well, let's set you up an internship and connect you to this advocate. So, which is just to say, it's less, there's a responsibility, but it's a different kind of responsibility. It's developing a relationship with somebody and then trying to find ways to support them as they get out of the system so they don't end up back in.
Well, thanks all of you. I wish we had more time, but thank you, Wendy and Namac, and wonderful panelists.
Thank you.
Stay right there for a minute. Thank you, guys.